Aotearoa, and welcome to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation three-part webinar series on Christian-Muslim relations with Professor Douglas Pratt. Welcome again. It's great to have listened to Professor Douglas Pratt give us an overview of the very important topic of Christian-Muslim relations, starting off with the history, the historical narrative, and looking at it from a contemporary perspective in his second episode. And today we're going to hear from him about the principles of interfaith dialogue. Those other videos are currently uploaded on the Pearl of the Islands Foundation YouTube website, or YouTube site rather, and you could have access to them. Professor Douglas Pratt, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be back again.
Thank you. How was your week?
Oh, it's been pretty good. Quiet. Still in lockdown, can't do much, but we've now just today gone to what's called level 2. So whoopee, we have freedom, at least to a degree.
Yes, it's great to see that things are slowly de-escalating. So we're looking forward to things returning back to normal. So we'll move on to today's program, shall we? So today, again, as a topic, principles of interfaith dialogue. For those of us who are joining for the very first time, a short bio of Professor Douglas Pratt. He has taught religious studies at the University of Waikato for over 30 years, retiring in mid-2018. Currently, he holds appointments as Honorary Professor in the Theological and Religious Studies program of the University of Auckland and Adjunct Professor at the Theology and Interreligious Relations in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Bern, Switzerland. Recently, he was elected a Fellow of both the Royal Historical Society and of the Royal Asiatic Society. His research interests include Christian-Muslim relations, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues in religion. And he is also the chief editor of a major volume of thematic essays in Christian-Muslim relations, a bibliographical history series published by Leiden in Brill, and is also a member of the Pearl of the Islands Foundation Advisory Board. You can also participate in this conversation, this dialogue, by asking any questions in the chat section of the YouTube page. So feel free to ask any questions throughout the conversation. And what we'll do now is hand it over to Professor Douglas Pratt to talk about the principles of interfaith dialogue.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back here again. And if you've got my screen on, you'll be able to see hopefully the PowerPoint I've put up. Principles of interfaith dialogue. Can we go get further? It's kind of an underlying question. So let's begin. I want to start by looking at the issue of what I call contextual paradigms. What's the kind of context in which we engage with a religious other? Christian with Muslim, Muslim with Christian, whoever. And you see there's three. These have been broad categories that have been identified by scholars. Inclusivism really means the position of rejection of the other, of taking a position that my religion, my perspective is the only right one, and therefore, on that basis, usually dialogue doesn't happen, or it's very, very limited. This has the issue of exclusionary versus uniqueness as different ways in which exclusivism is understood. Typically, the exclusionary one tends to predominate. People just assume that, whereas uniqueness, I think, allows for the reality that each religion is unique and therefore exclusive in that sense, like an exclusive menu. It doesn't mean you don't eat it. It means you have something unique to offer, which is different to exclusionary. But exclusivism is the first one. That sense of rejection of the other has been dominant throughout much of history. Inclusivism is another option which has come in over time, and this one has a sense of incorporating the other into our own system. We still regard ourselves as the only fully right one, and of course it raises questions of superiority, of supersession, of imperialism, and so on. But it certainly has been one of the contextual paradigms within which relations between religions, between Christians and Muslims, have operated. The last one is the more contemporary perspective that's emerged, although it's really been around a while. And this is called pluralism, which is the affirmation of the other as other. This means giving a sense of equality and validity to the multiplicity of faith perspectives, whether that is within one's own religious tradition or between them. It also refers to affirming a diversity of pluralist perspectives. There's more than one way of understanding pluralism, in other words. For example, the common denominator perspective to a radical differentiation perspective, from a view that we're equal but rivals, or equal but complementary, and so on. But one way or another, this certainly provides a solid basis for cooperative ventures and dialogue. When we talk about dialogue, there's been 4 models that have been identified, what we could call the classic dialogue models of life, action, experience, and discourse. The dialogue of life is just simply the interaction that happens in everyday life without necessarily any reference to religion, except the recognition that we are from different religious backgrounds. Action, of course, is where we combine together intentionally to do things. Experience is where we actually explore religion, our own experience of religion together. For example, I mentioned last week in one of the dialogues that happened recently that had prayer as its focus, and to actually share in what it means to engage in prayer and to be a praying person from one's own religious perspective is a basis of dialogue of experience, which differs from the dialogue of discourse, which is often what we think about when we talk or use the word dialogue as an intellectual exercise. And what these models indicate is that dialogue is much more than simply a talk fest. But let's take this a bit further. I want to look now at just some Christian models and then some Muslim perspectives. So the Christian models I've identified with my research into, firstly, the World Council of Churches. And I found that their dialogue models were very interesting. There's the systemic, the dialogue of experts. That's very much that last one I mentioned a moment ago, the dialogue of discourse. Communitarian is the dialogical involvement of community building, a particular, if you like, slant on the dialogue of action. And relational is another model which was very much used in the work of the World Council of Churches, where dialogue has very much an educational orientation and the building up of relationships. Similarly with the Vatican or Roman Catholic Church, their dialogue models. Very interesting here because the Vatican, being a city-state, functions like a nation in a way which other churches don't. So there are ambassadors to the Holy See, ambassadors not just to Rome, but to the Vatican. And you have therefore the phenomenon, unique phenomenon, of ambassadorial dialogue, formal diplomatic relationships between, for example, a Muslim nation and the Vatican as a nation. And that opens up all sorts of other kinds of interactions and activities. This term here, propedeutic, is another model that is where dialogue is preparatory for something else, where it has, again, the educative self-presentation dimension, similar to the WCC, and often where the host-guest paradigm comes very much to the fore. And that's something we could explore later, but it's a very significant element in the dialogical endeavor one way or another. And humanitarian is their particular slant there, again, action for community benefit. Now, I think of some Muslim perspectives and looking at the what I call originating paradigms that one can detect in the time of Medina and through the Quran. And you have here various examples of both positive and negative interactions. Initially, and not unlike Christianity, some ambiguity in respect of how otherness, particularly religious otherness, is to be perceived and understood. But clearly, there's a measure of acceptance of the context and fact of others. It's just the way in which, the issue here is the way in which others are to be accommodated or not in one's own relationships. And that takes us a bit further into a Muslim context. And Islamic paradigms for interreligious relations can be discerned in terms of historico-legal paradigms, for example, in relation to dhimmi communities, the cultural interactions that took place, particularly in the development of the great empires. And then more interestingly, I think, for our purposes, is contemporary paradigms, which is exemplified by quite a large number of different Muslim organizations, including Pearl of the Islands Foundation and Hizmet and so on, where, well, the exclusivism is not that, of course, but there is exclusivism that comes through in some areas in the Muslim world, as it does in the Christian world. But these last two refer particularly to the positive engagement of faithful openness where the dialogue is engaged in, and community affirmation the engagement in various kind of societal or social type of activities and affirming community and so on. So in other words, here we have various contemporary, negative and positive contemporary paradigms that one can certainly see in the Muslim world, and from there can see them in the Christian world as well. But also out of the Muslim world comes the work and example of Fethullah Gulen, where he articulated 7 elements of interfaith dialogue. We can't go into these in detail here, but it's worth being aware of this kind of the nuance in this particular set, the distinction between primary and secondary values, the motif of intentionality as being a principal perspective in engagement in dialogue, the mark of tolerance as an inherent element as he expressed it, seeing dialogue as itself an expression of divinely inspired love. I think that's a very interesting element to pick up on. Reconciliation, the essence of religion, which is made manifest in dialogue, of course. And this one, hermeneutical authority for dialogue, takes us into the question of on what basis do we as religious people engage in dialogue from out of our religion? What's the religious authority for that? And that has to be discerned very much in terms of the way in which texts and history are interpreted. And then, of course, Gulen brings in another way of thinking of ijtihad as the struggle for dialogue. And that, I think, is also a very interesting perspective. But now moving from this quick overview of some Christian and Muslim perspectives, let's go into some general principles of dialogue that we can discern from a number of quarters. The first one I want to pick up is articulated by Pope John Paul II, who was quite a champion in the latter part of the 20th century. And he articulated it this way: the rationale for Christian-Muslim dialogue as being to move beyond a dwelling upon and obsessively retelling the past offences each has suffered at the hands of the other, working to make the future different from the past. In other words, let's not wallow in the past. We recognise it. We can certainly talk about it, but let's move on beyond that and see where we can go. He talks about there being a strong theological basis for unity of respect and purpose, characterizing the relationship that ought to obtain between Muslims and Christians. In other words, the basis is there, and I think that echoes something of what Fethullah Gulen was referring to. And the Pope John Paul II referred to common elements which go much deeper than simply superficial points of contact. They determine rather the very way that both communities of believers approach God and respond to his will. In other words, there's something about here, an invitation to go deeper than simply articulating what appear to be common elements. And so when we reflect on this a bit further, we find also this kind of line of thought that conversion, often our religions are about conversion, but rather than thinking of conversion being to the other side, in other words, Christians wanting Muslims to convert to Christianity, Muslims wanting Christians to convert to Islam, you can see that actually the deeper conversion is to God. Wherever we are, we're being asked to convert, to return to or back to God as such, turning to God in response to God's turning to us as the essence of Christian-Muslim engagement. So that, for example, some people will critique dialogue as saying, well, the purpose is actually to win people over. But yes, to win them over, but to what? And so the challenge here is saying what we're looking towards in terms of any conversion is actually to a deeper understanding and response to God. And so in that respect, of course, there's no place in dialogue for self-imposition, nor for the desire to succeed or expand at the cost of others. Dialogue is neither a tool of condescension nor a technique of proselytization. And that's sometimes, there are certain circumstances where that has to be brought to the fore, and people need to be reminded of that. It's very easy for some to slip into or from a dialogical engagement into an engagement of proselytizing or missionizing one of the other. So rather than that, it should be a process of enrichment, and it is and can be, in which each receives in learning from the other. And I think many people who are involved in dialogue at lots of different levels will affirm that they have come away having learned much, not only about the other, but often about themselves. And so each side in that process must take seriously that which is supremely significant for the other. Even if we don't understand it, the point is to recognize what is significant for the other and to respect that. So the aims of dialogue coming out of that reflection would be to say, well, it's to do with achieving better and informed relations, applying spiritual resources to common problems, discerning ways of practical cooperation, growth and mutual understanding, countering prejudice and falsehoods, practical acts of cooperation. And we can see here already those original models I referred to are being reflected. Deepening an already held faith. People sometimes think, people who are opposed or suspicious of dialogue, think that if you talk to a person of another faith, you are threatening your own. In fact, what many find is that it results in a deepening of our own faith as such, broadening and deepening it, not undermining it at all. Certainly, dialogue aims at raising basic questions of human life and existence. That is quite critical. Dialogue does not seek to suppress differences, but rather to explore them frankly and self-critically. This is now becoming a bit more aspirational in terms of the challenge and the demands of dialogue, but I think it's quite important. And the reason for doing that is in the hope of achieving a form of convergence that would not be an impatient syncretism, as one has expressed it, but rather an openness to God's further guidance. So we're brought back to that sense in which dialogue, in terms of interreligious dialogue, particularly between religions of revelation, is actually in order, in a deeper sense, to be open to God's further guidance in our context and time. And so it's both necessary and urgent that Christians and Muslims continue to be in dialogue. Further, in terms of the aims of dialogue, one can say that the underlying theological questions between Christian-Muslim dialogue is unavoidable. For example, can Muslims accept Christians theologically and not merely as protected persons in the Islamic State? Conversely, can Christians accept Muslims and find a place for Islam, theologically speaking? And that leads off to all sorts of possibilities and other questions. But in this little section, with a caveat and an exhortation, which comes from Michael Fitzgerald, the former General Secretary of the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue, and a person well grounded in Christian-Muslim relations. He makes the comment that dialogue is a much used word, and so there's a risk that it may become debased currency, that people will begin to think it's had its day. If Christian-Muslim encounters to continue to be true interreligious dialogue, it must be solidly grounded in faith in God, be sustained by a spirit of prayer, and flow into common action. I think, again, those are dimensions of the dialogical dynamic that each side needs to be fully appreciative of and work at, and if we are to continue in dialogue that is actually genuinely theological and true to our faith. So that brings me now, in this rather quick presentation, to articulate principles of interfaith dialogue, preconditions and rules of engagement, as I have discerned them. And I've got these three sets of what I call preconditions for dialogue, which are worth teasing out. Theology and togetherness. What is our concept of God, of Allah? What key theological values do we bring into any kind of interrelationship with a person of another faith? And in particular, Christians and Muslims together, what do we bring? I mean, immediately one thinks, can say, well, you know, Christians have one concept of God and as Trinitarian, and Muslims as Tawheed, as unitary. But that's only a beginning statement. There are other dimensions of understanding what we mean by God, the love of God, the mercy of God, the compassion of God, etc. And we find that actually the concept of God we're working from will actually, the dominant dimensions of that will affect how we approach dialogue very clearly. together with key theological values that I've just mentioned, the values of love, of mercy, of compassion, as against values of judgment or wanting to be right and the other wrong, that kind of thing. And the togetherness factor is very much this notion of non-exclusion of the other, which comes back to where I began with those contextual paradigms. If we are exclusive in the sense of exclusionary, then obviously we are not open to any kind of engagement of the other that takes the other seriously. But if we're having serious dialogue, then it presupposes this condition that we are not excluding the other in their otherness, who they are as different. It's part of what we're part of the reason why we're engaged is because we are different to each other, and yet not so different that we can't engage. Which brings us to diversity and identity. And this means that as a precondition for any kind of interreligious dialogue, interfaith dialogue, there has to be a measure of acceptance and affirmation of the fact of plurality and that we are all part of the plural mix. We're all part of the diversity of our time and place. That's the nature of reality. And it goes back to the one I just mentioned, the concept of God. Do we think of God, if we think of God as the creator of all, the Lord of all, then that's all encompasses the diversity of which we are a part. And so you start to put these things together and you see here are the preconditions for taking dialogue very seriously and engaging in it. And so this takes us now to the structure and purpose, that whatever the context is, what's the model that we're working from? What's the appropriate dialogical model and the agenda that might go with that? So that, for example, obviously, you don't dive into a deep theological dialogue if really what you're after is some common action over some social issue. There may be a dimension of that discourse, but that's not the primary model. So understanding a model, understanding what's appropriate, understanding what the agenda is, and being on the same page, as it were, the part of the preconditions. Then when we engage in dialogue, there's going to be some basic rules, and there's lots of different examples of people who have articulated rules or steps or the points to dialogue. But this is my for what they're worth that I've reflected on and thought about. Respect, humility, curiosity, and focus. And of course, they flow out of the things we've just been talking about. Respect, that's the basis of showing mutual dignity and validity and acceptance one of the other. It takes that precondition I mentioned now into the engagement itself to manifest respect in the way in which we talk and address, and if you're the host, setting the scene, and if you're the guest, how you respond according to the context. Humility is, of course, entering into an engagement, at least on the basis of accepting common humanity. We're all human beings. We all have a surprising amount of similarity in terms of our humanness, our abilities, our failures, our strengths, our weaknesses, our desires, our impulses, our needs. And in relation to that, to acknowledge that we can experience and express very similar faith dynamics and dimensions. We're not the same, but we're about the same kind of thing. So that humility dimension, I think, is very important as a rule of engagement. But also with that goes curiosity. There's no point in going into a dialogue if you think you know it all and there's nothing for you to learn either about the other or certainly not about yourself. Dialogue presupposes and requires, as you go into it, this sense of openness, of curiosity, to inquire, to seek information, to try and obtain a measure of understanding from out of that, in order not only to know the other better, but in the process to come to a deeper understanding of oneself, and importantly, how we are to go forward in terms of relationship one to the other. Which then brings us to the fourth rule, the rule of focus. And this is the role of attending to dynamics over or through details. This is particularly important, I think, in the area of the dialogue of discourse, where we're getting into very much theological or ideological topics, as opposed to, for example, engaging in a dialogue of action or some other kind of social venture. Because here, the point is this, that very often we get caught up, and you can see it, the history of Christian and Muslim relations that I've been part of, the academic process and project, shows that very often when two sides come together, between religions or within religions, but where there are differences, often dialogue breaks down into a competitive debate where the focus is on the details, on the data, and which is right, which is wrong. Sometimes even within our texts, we find differences of detail, and people argue that one is the right and the other is wrong. The reality actually is, in terms of our understanding our religion, and this hooks back into what I said before about what is your concept of God that goes with it, because here, what I'm seeing is that within each of our faiths, it's the dynamics that are far more significant than the details. If you like, what is God showing us, telling us, revealing to us through the details, not only of the texts that we refer to, the Quran on the one hand, the Bible on the other, but our histories and our experience, our thinking, our understanding, and so on. The dynamics, I think, are far more important than the details. And in that way, we can then come to a new way of assessing what is in common. What are the commonalities that we hold as against differences, and also what are the parallels? Because sometimes I think we find that in our religious life, we find ourselves that we're doing things in parallel. We're doing them differently, but they're the same sorts of things. Take prayer, for example. We pray differently in terms of how we do it, but very often it's parallel in terms of the underlying intentions and so on. So respect, humility, curiosity, focus. I just put those up as guiding rules of engagement. They're not the only ones, but I think they're worth looking at and thinking about. And to conclude, the point of interfaith dialogue is that it's a journey. The journey of dialogue is what it's about. There is no quick fix. And it may seem a bit facile to say that, but in our day and age, as we know, any program you put up, people want to know, well, how do you go to know when you got to the end? What are your measurables? The reality is, in dialogue, there is no final measurable goal of the journey, because the journey is the goal. Dialogical engagement is the purpose. You don't engage in dialogue in order to do something else. You engage in dialogue because that is the way that we are meant to be, dialogical. The way of the journey resets religious identity in that sense, because the dialogical way is the way of being religious. And that ties in with what we were saying earlier about how do we understand God in all this, and our relationship to God, and our relationship to one another as equally children of God, although differently expressing and experiencing that, and so on. The way of the journey resets religious identity as being a dialogical way. And that then takes us to this other element of post-dialogical reflection. When we have engaged in any kind of dialogue, what then? It's not so much that we then say, well, the dialogue's over, so we reach the end. No, the dialogical engagement has reached its terminal point, and the question that remains is, what has been learned? What might it mean for me, for us as interlocutors, as persons involved in dialogue, for us together in the dialogical relationship? And what does it teach me about my own faith and my own faith relationship, for example? So in the end, we say, well, reality, dialogue is a process, or we understand dialogue as a process, a combination of being open and being faithful, which I'll end there because, by the way, that's the title of a book which I wrote just a few years ago. Admittedly, it was aimed at the Christian community, but it has principles in it which go a lot further. Being open, being faithful, the dialogue The Journey of Interreligious Dialogue. And the only other book I'll mention is The Understanding Interreligious Relations, from which I've drawn some other material, which was done a few years ago as well. So there we are.
Thank you, Professor Douglas Pratt, for that insightful presentation. You've certainly given us a lot there to take away. I really loved how you presented the rules of engagement, the preconditions, and you're right, dialogue is really a journey. There is no end point. I mean, if we do say that, hey, we've come together, we've had a cup of tea, we've exchanged a few conversations, and that's the end, well, you know, how else are we going to grow? And that is it's a salient point to be mindful of, that it's all about continual growth, and dialogue, and continual dialogue rather, helps propel that growth. So thank you for sharing that with us. May I remind our viewers that if you'd like to ask a question to Professor Douglas Pratt, you can do so on the chat section of the YouTube, and we'll move straight into that section right now if you want. Got a question here which sort of touches on last week's point as well. So in modern society, how can we foster interfaith dialogue to increase understanding and acceptance? And which approach do you think is best suited to countries like New Zealand, Australia, and other leading Western nations, where there is plurality of faiths?
Can you run that past me again? That seems to be quite a lot on that one.
Okay, it says, in modern society, how could we foster interfaith dialogue to increase understanding and acceptance?
It's a tricky one, that, because I mean, I guess the way is actually trying to do more of it, and the question is, how do you get people to do it? What engagement? It reminds me of I was at a conference a few years ago in Australia, where at the conference dinner, each table we were given a task. And I can't remember the conference, whether it was a Christian Muslim one, but it certainly was an interfaith one. Anyhow, no, it must have been Christian, to do with Islam in Australia and Christian and relations. Anyhow, the point was this: some similar kind of question came up, and the challenge was to each table was to come up with some kind of ideas how to actually improve relations, how to involve people more in a similar way to that question's asked. And the table I was at, we suggested the best way would be to have, have more community halal barbecues, because in Australia and New Zealand, it's the barbies we all like. You have a barbecue, everybody comes around to the barbecue, and you have fellowship, you have conversation, etc., etc. Now, I know COVID-19's got in the way at the moment, but our table actually won the competition. Everybody thought, yes, that's the way to go. And this was several hundred people of Australia and New Zealand, thinking about this kind of thing. But I think what it, humorous though it was, what it just goes to show was that sometimes we need to come at it obliquely, more from the point of view of just social interaction, engaging as people. Or to give another example that came from a situation in the UK quite some years ago now, where a very good, a very articulate woman Muslim who was the principal of a school, a primary school, I think, was asked this question about, having Christian Muslim dialogue. And basically she said was, well, if you're having, going to invite us, and of course she was, I think, Pakistan born, but UK raised, but, the point being that the Muslims coming around would not be necessarily born and raised in England. So English is their second language. Excuse me. So her comment was, when you bring us together for dialogue, don't sit down with an agenda like a piece of paper. Ask us what we'd like to drink, a cup of tea or coffee. Ask us about the weather, how are your kids getting on, etc., etc. Excuse me. I'm caught in my throat. In other words, begin with ways of human interaction, human connectedness, and take it from there.
Yeah, and I think what you touched on in terms of food and hospitality, that's a great manifestation of interfaith dialogue, and it's well practiced between the two faith traditions. I mean, now we're in the middle of Ramadan. Traditionally, we invite our non-Muslim friends to a dinner table, and likewise during, particularly around Christmas era, our Christian friends invite us over for a barbecue, like you mentioned. And it's also worth mentioning that the Christian charity organisations that are indiscriminate with their relief work, particularly when they deliver food hampers to families, particularly in this COVID era. And it's much appreciated of them and all the other charity organisations, whether it be faith-based or secular. So I just want to quickly put that plug in there and say thank you to everyone who's doing their fair share.
Enough. And if I may just add to that, I mean, one that comes to mind is being invited to an iftar dinner. And in that context, a dialogue opens up. We have a conversation, and that takes you more naturally into a dialogue. So where it flows more naturally out of friendly interaction, I think it's much more satisfying and more likely to happen.
Yeah, thanks. We have a question here that someone wants to pick you up on Fethullah Gulen's elements of interfaith dialogue, and I just wanted you to expound further on that word reconciliation. Are you able to offer a few more words around that word reconciliation?
Yeah, probably the better word I would use would be conciliation. Reconciliation does have the sense of coming back together again when you've been apart and rejoining. That's certainly not what Gulen meant, and I think the word that probably I'd like to say conciliation is actually knowing how to be separate, but not at loggerheads, not enemies. In other words, reconciled in the sense of being friends with one another, but not reconciled in the sense of actually losing our identities and joining one to the other in that sense. There's an interesting, that I think would be the better way to express it. But the term that was used then was reconciliation, but only in the sense, of course, of overcoming antipathy that I talked about 2 weeks ago, in order to affirm inquiry and affinity, that we have more together in common that we should be building on. And I think also flagging what Pope John Paul referred to was this notion of conversion as turning to God, that we should be working together in our own way to actually promote the divine rather than our own backyard. So that's the kind of line that was taken there.
So it's recognition of our differences and using that as an opportunity to engage, to learn more about each other.
Yeah.
Got another question here saying that the aims and benefits of interfaith dialogue are plenty, as you've stated, but some would argue that ultimately beliefs do end up clashing. And how would you respond to this concern? And I'd like to just add my little bit here. Obviously, humanity has a broad spectrum, and irrespective of whether you're faith or ideological position, you're going to get people who are exclusionist. How would we be able to work with the people who have the mindset of an exclusionist approach, where they see dialogue as a threat or use it as an opportunity to coerce their views upon the other, to almost missionary and things like that? And that happens on both sides. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that is the big challenge. That's the combination of interfaith and intra-faith challenge. But it goes back to very much our basic concept of God, what God means to us, and how we understand God as creator and creation in that. And so there are two things there. One is that, yes, in the end, of course, there is no overcoming the fact that particular beliefs are different. Like you can't. How can I? Take a classic. Christians have the belief of the divinity of Christ. Muslims have the belief that Jesus was a prophet like Muhammad, peace be upon him. So in other words, human being. Now, those are beliefs, but then you have to ask the question, what are the beliefs actually pointing towards? What are they actually about? So beliefs can be, at one level, can be metaphysical, which is the reality of Jesus is was divine, or the reality was that he was not. Or the beliefs can be, if you like, dynamic and theological, in the sense that in the articulation of the belief, we're actually trying to say something about the reality of God. So it becomes, in the end, of course, you'll still say, well, he was divine or not, and be that as it may. So at that point, there's a distinction there which you cannot overcome directly, and that takes me back to the comment I made at the end about looking at the dynamics rather than the details, or the data. The data is that one text says that he's human, the other text indicates that he is divine. So then you have to say, well, one text is right and one text is wrong. My one is right, so therefore your one is wrong. And so we end up in this impasse and go round and round in circles. And that's the exclusionary perspective of exclusivism, where it says our uniqueness means that the other one, if it is different to us, can't possibly be right. But there's another perspective, which is to say that neither of them are right nor wrong. Each of them are beliefs that are telling us something about the divine and how we've experienced the divine. And that takes us into another whole dimension altogether of exploring the meaning of faith and the meaning of our understanding of beliefs. And I guess too, what that also flags is there are two ways in which we actually use the word and the idea of belief. One is belief in, and the other is belief that. The belief that is simply the classic correspondence theory of truth. If you believe that it is raining, you look outside and you say, is it raining or is it not? You can see, and you know if your belief is wrong, right or wrong. If you believe in rain, what you're saying is that I believe that rain is important for my existence. Whether or not it's raining at the moment is irrelevant. I believe in rain, I believe in water. Now, similarly with theological beliefs, a belief that slides us into the area which is strictly speaking metaphysics, whether something is or is not the case, either in a metaphysical or historical sense. Believing in is a faith perspective of meaning, value, and so on, which still will have within it, of course, issues of fact and historicity where they apply, but very often they go way beyond that. And that takes us back to the dynamic.
So it sounds like it's okay to disagree, but as long as we don't reduce it to a binary position that I'm right, you're wrong, and we get into that.
Exactly. If you like, put another way, is that we end up with binaries. We have to then ask the question, all right, we both believe in God. We both believe there is one God. We have different views on how this God is manifest and relates in these particular ways. So what do we have to do to rethink our concept of God? Because obviously God's not a fool. Obviously God's not trying to sort of bluff us. So obviously something is going on here that we have to think about more carefully, more deeply, and not just assume that one of us got it right and the other one got it wrong.
Thank you. I've got a question here about if you're aware of anything that's happening recently in response to Pope Francis's call about in support of the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity.
Human
fraternity?
Fraternity. Sorry, yeah. I can't comment on that. I haven't heard of that.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Fair enough. Another question about some areas where we have seen the faith communities come together. One is the environment and ecology, and there is a interfaith committee that is trying to address environmental concerns, obviously providing perspectives and then trying to call into action. Can you think of other areas where you could see greater interfaith cooperation, not just between the Christians and Muslims, but between the other faith traditions that are pressing and require immediate attention?
Well, I think, yeah, well, there's the mutual support in terms, of course, the current pandemic situation, of giving care and support one to another. But that takes me into an area where I think it's also quite important and quite tricky, and that is the recognition that at the moment we are all acutely aware of a medical virus and its threat to human existence. What I think we also need to recognize is the threat to human existence of ideological viruses. And that's where I think faith communities need to be very careful that their religious sensibility is not infiltrated by an ideological virus that undermines it and captures it. We certainly can track various instances in the past, and I think examples even in contemporary times, where you have a sense that there a political ideology has infiltrated into a religious sensibility to produce what we currently, of course, refer to as the alt-right or right-wing religion of some kind or other, but usually some forms of other extremism, etc. And I think for the faith communities to be alert to that and be able to sort of combat it, address it together, not just apart, but the reason I say that one, because I'm aware that at the moment you still have a situation that from within certain communities, there can be a hostile, not just a reaction, but almost a presupposition that this other community has got it in for them because of these ideological perspectives. And so I view that as a kind of like a virus, because you have, for example, all religions, this is a very general statement, of course, all religions promote the idea of peace and harmony and goodwill. And yet from out of religions, you'll have the exact opposite being expressed. Why? Where's that come from? Is that really part of the religion, or is that something that's infiltrated into the religion? And that's a virus which I think has been incipient and is dangerous, and is something we have to work to combat together.
It's good that you mentioned that, because I was going to ask a question about what you see as the future challenges for the relations between Christians and Muslims. And one thing that sort of comes to mind is, when we do come out of COVID-19, however the world may look then, there is a concern that minority groups, and that maybe minority faith groups, may be subjected to more ridicule and discrimination by the dominant group. So in terms, and you sort of talked about interfaith earlier in one of your responses. I mean, what can we do as, I guess, Muslims here in New Zealand and Australia to reach out to our friends in other parts of the world who are Muslims, who are part of the dominant group, to be concerned and look out for the welfare of the minority faith traditions, and they may be Christians and vice versa. So what responsibility is there for us in terms of people of faith, people who are active in trying to increase interfaith awareness and understanding, to do more interfaith both nationally and internationally through like friends and family across the lands and the seas?
I think that's a very good one, topic to get into, because it's the issue of minorities, and we have two things happening in the world today. One is that in many respects, particularly in societies where not just secularization, but secularism, and with that an anti-religious sentiment, is actually on the rise. And where it's likely, if not already, to be actually the dominant view of the population, then religion itself, even the so-called major religions, will find themselves, or are finding themselves, in a position, in a minority position. And then, of course, you've got the phenomenon of quite small religious communities in the minority within the wider religious context, and particularly in societies that still are dominantly of one religion. And whether that's whether that's notional or real is neither here nor there in this context of dealing with minorities. So the challenge, I think, for interfaith engagement at this level is to explore together what are the essential teachings and theological values from within our religions in respect of the other who is not us, whether it's a religious minority or just of another culture or race or whatever. And I mean, there's been plenty of times where we've seen, and that comes back to my comment about ideological virus, where the sense in which in our traditions, in our texts, in our basic understandings of the divine, the notion of offering hospitality to the stranger, of looking after the widowed, the orphan, and so on, of supporting those in need, it's quite clear in terms of the ethical value systems of our religious traditions. But very often we honor that in the breach, not in actually doing it in the way in which we should. And sometimes it flips into a reverse situation I've been just reading recently of the situation in France in the 1940s in World War II, where a Catholic person was trying to shelter a Jewish person because of the rise of anti-Semitism and when the Nazis took over France. And you have then another example that, and there's plenty of examples of this, of people of a particular Christian sensibility were aware that this targeting of Jews was totally wrong, and yet there were others who went along with it. And you have that same thing in other situations as well, of Christians targeting Muslims, Muslims targeting Christians. It's quite contrary to the essence of our faith, but it happens. And so it has to be constantly monitored and addressed and challenged. And to do that, we need opportunities to recall what our faith traditions are about, but also opportunities to frankly express our perceptions, our histories, our lack of understandings, not to wallow in it, but to try, what can we learn from that? What went wrong and why? And of course, one of the areas of that is the jumping to conclusions, to injecting into a situation a presupposition. It's classically at the moment, when you come back, to the medical virus, how there are examples of increased racism against Asians, particularly Chinese. Oh, you brought the virus; it's your fault. It's like Muslims in Australia and New Zealand being blamed for what happened in 9/11. It was your fault. You're a Muslim. It's your fault. And it was crazy stuff. But that's unfortunately what people do. But I have to say, my observation is that most people who do that are actually not themselves deeply religious. The virus that I'm talking about, the ideological virus, affects those particularly who are already, from a secular perspective, are anti-religious, hostile to religion per se. But also you've got the where you have within our religions, the exclusivist perspective looks for something to undermine the other. And so it becomes a dangerous virus in its own right. So not easy to come up with a clear answer, but I'm certainly acutely aware what the challenge is, and that the only way forward is to not do less of dialogical engagement, but find ways of doing more.
Well, the slogan of COVID-19 is we're all in it together. And obviously,
Yes.
on the note that you just finished up on, this is a challenge that befalls upon all people of faith, not just the Christian Muslim traditions, but people of faith, to remain vigilant, remain steadfast, and keep an open heart and be compassionate. I guess that's one way of possibly trying to overcome the ideological virus that may be a threat to all of us. So, Professor Douglas Pratt, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for today's presentation. I will take away those rules of engagement to be respectful, remain humble, stay curious and focused. So thank you for that wonderful reminder there. Thank you to our viewers for staying with us for the 3-part series. Just a reminder that this episode will also be uploaded to the Pearl of the Islands Foundation's YouTube page, and you can catch this and the previous 2 episodes. On that note, thank you again, Professor Douglas Pratt, and hopefully we'll be able to see you on future occasions.
Thank you.
On similar topics or topics that may be of interest to the general public. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.